Hi, it is February 25th, Wednesday. I'm Eric. I'm back with another video. And I was just thinking about a couple of conversations. One was a conversation with some friends, and also an interesting interview between Daniel Davis and Alexander Mercouris, talking about the Ukraine war. So I wanted to address that issue. But first of all, I want to just place the Ukraine war in the context of what I call civilizational war, and by that I mean that we are in the middle of numerous wars, and I'm just going to delineate them. The three main wars that we're contemplating right now that we hear about are the so-called Russia-Ukraine war. Um, we have the Israeli-Palestine war. We have the incipient war of the United States against Iran. And there's also a war in waiting, you might say, with Taiwan, because China is basically in the crosshairs of the United States. Certainly economic war has been going on, but it hasn't become hot, but it could. But I'm just going to go through. There's actually many wars going on right now. So there's, as I mentioned, the Israeli-Gaza war, the Russian-Ukraine war, and the possibility of a war in Iran, and the possibility of war on Taiwan. But we also have a war going on, a Sudan civil war. There's quite high casualties there in the thousands. There's the Yemen civil war, which is ongoing, and it had high overall, not so many right now, but Saudi Arabia was attacking, and it still hasn't been resolved. Ethiopia there's high casualties there. Syria, of course, that was an ongoing civil war, and it still hasn't resolved itself, because even though the ISIS head chopper got control of the country thanks to the help of his now backers in Washington, there's still a lot of turmoil going on there. People are resisting his government, so it's hard to say how that's going to turn out. You also have the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are high casualties there. You have the Sahel insurgencies, that is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And there's high casualties there. In Myanmar, there's high casualties in Myanmar between the government, the military government there, and resistance groups. Many of them are based on ethnicity, but they're all backed by foreign backing. Somalia has high casualties, and of course they're trying to split off. The Israelis are trying to split off Somaliland from Somalia, so that creates more problems. Then, of course, we have the Libyan civil war, which is ongoing. Libya was a stable country until 2011, when the United States and Europe went in and basically destroyed it. And then we have Afghanistan, which is apparently is an insurgency and terrorist threats still going on there, although not as intensely as it was in the past. Then you have the Central African Republic, with it says government and international forces versus multiple rebel coalitions, militaries and foreign military contractors present. And there's moderate casualties there. There's Nagorno-Karabakh, which is apparently still kind of ongoing in a latent form. Haiti, you have gang warfare going on there. Mexico, we just saw what's going on in Mexico with high casualties there. Colombia, there's moderate casualties. Colombia was in a much harsher civil war for quite a long time, but it seems to have somewhat stabilized. And in the Philippines, there's also some insurgent groups in the Philippines. And in Venezuela, of course, the possibility of civil war breaking out there is rather high, because if the United States, really, the U.S. is really, coming down on the government, but the people, there's a lot of armed opposition to the U.S. presence there. So it's hard to say how that will turn out. And then we have the Kashmir War. This is India-Pakistan border tensions. Those countries have been, in conflict for a long time, although right now the casualties are low. But most of these aren't even reported on. And I actually had to, I used ChatGPT to list them all, and I had to remind them that they didn't even mention Iran or Taiwan. I had to mention that to them. And then you have the situation, I call him the hapless Steve Witkoff. And Witkoff, it sounds to me that it's got a kind of a Yiddish, that's the indigenous Eastern European Jewish language, which is closely related to German. And my guess is that it probably literally might mean something like wise head. But I would, wit, he has wit, a lot of wit, which can mean either humorous, or also it can mean that you have intelligence. But I would call him Witless Kopf, because the guy, he recently came out with a couple of remarkable statements. One of them was that Iran is on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon, even though the Trump administration had said that they had completely destroyed the capability to make a nuclear weapon, back when the United States obliterated their nuclear facilities. But they're back at it. Is this paranoia or what? This like obsessive fear of Iran's nuclear program. Really very strange. And what was the other thing that Witkoff was talking about? I don't know, it escapes my mind at the moment. But I was recently in conversation with some friends of mine over lunch, and one of them is an Iraq war veteran, and another one is just an average American person, and myself, and there was also a Russian guy. And we didn't get into a real argument. I didn't want to, I didn't want to disrupt the meal by shattering their illusions, according to me. But they were talking about, basically the unprovoked attack on Ukraine by Russia. And I was thinking, so here's this guy who was a Marine. He invaded Iraq, which was about 5,000 to 8,000 miles away from the U.S. border, and yet we were saying that Iraq was an imminent threat with its weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist, or the babies that were thrown out of an incubator, that didn't exist either. And yet here's this guy criticizing Russia over a war that was clearly, provoked. So I want to make a little connection here between the Ukraine war and the Iraq war. That's the main point that I'm coming to in this discussion. So the Ukraine war is a war that is taking place on Russia, the Russian Federation's border, involving a country that has been in the Russian cultural space for centuries. And yet a CIA coup took place in 2014, following years of CIA influence and nurturing of Nazi collaborators of Hitler after World War II. And they sure enough, they try hard enough, you destabilize a country, you create disharmony in the population, you get the worst, most brutal people to get control, and lo and behold, you have this war of Ukraine against Russia. But it's not Ukraine against Russia, because as Lindsey Graham has famously said, we're fighting we, we, Lindsey Graham and his government, we are fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. So let's not call this the Ukraine-Russia war. Let's call it the U.S.-Russia war, because that's exactly what it is. Now, in the case of Iraq, what happened in Iraq? I just did a little checking on this. I kind of knew this, but in 1958, I guess it was. Well, actually, what happened was after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was broken up, and the Iraq came under the control of the British, and they inserted a monarch backed by the British. But there was a coup against that monarch by some left-wing generals, and so it was a kind of a revolutionary government, you might say. But according to the research, the CIA didn't like that because they were they were terrified of this communist threat, 8,000 miles away from the United States. And so they nurtured somebody named Saddam Hussein. He tried to stage a coup, apparently. He failed. I think he got wounded, and he took refuge. Eventually, he did get control of the Iraq government, and then the United States said, "Hey, Iraq, you're cool. Thank you, Saddam Hussein. And now that you're in charge of the country, why don't you go invade Iran?" Well, it turns out that Iran also had the CIA heavily involved in it in 1953. They overthrew the democratically elected government of Mossadegh. Now, what's so humorous about all this is that you listen to these talking heads on Fox News and all the other mainstream media, and they're saying the Islamic Republic is a dictatorship and they're no good and blah blah blah, and we need to have a democracy in Iran. Well, excuse me, but you had a democracy in Iran and you overthrew it because you wanted to get your bloody, dirty hands on their oil. And then when the Iranian people decided that they didn't like that, like the Shah, they installed the Islamic Republic. Now, granted, there are secular forces within Iran, and they're not all happy with the more theocratic government, but nonetheless, it does have elections, and it is what it is. And maybe just maybe, if we had just left Iran alone in the first place, they would have had their democracy and everything would have been fine. But no, we can't do that. We have to protect ourselves from the communists. What they're really saying is we need to get our hands on resources wherever they are in the world, wherever. And that is what the war of Ukraine against Russia is, because as Zbigniew Brzezinski pointed out in his book, The Grand Chessboard, as if this is just a game. They're going to use Ukraine in order to undermine Russia's place in the world. And eventually they want to get control of Russia's resources because, during the 1990s, the stock market was booming because the United States had just commandeered lots of the resources and wealth of the Eastern European countries as well as Russia. But things have not, basically the Eastern European countries, most of them are, poodles, you could say, of the West. But you do have countries like Hungary or Slovakia, and now even maybe Czechoslovakia, who are saying that they really don't want to play that game anymore. So you have this situation where you have a war, and this is a genocidal war. The population of Ukraine was 52 million at the end of World War. The end of World War II, after suffering catastrophic losses in that war, I think the population was about 35 million. But under the Soviet Union, it was the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic. The economy recovered. It became quite a highly industrialized, part of the Soviet Union, and life there seemed to be pretty damn good. But of course, the CIA didn't like that because, communism is inherently bad because it prevents us from robbing the resources of the countries of those of socialist or communist countries. That's that's their offense. So um, so anyway, in after 30 years of subversion, let's say, I guess starting in 1945, with their backing of Bandera and Shukovich and others, eventually they were managed to undermine the Ukrainian government to the extent that they were able to stage a coup. First in 2004, that eventually it half succeeded, but it failed when there wasn't an election in 2010, and Yanukovych was elected. But then they had to stage a second coup in 2014. That was successful, and that has been the cause of the current war that's been going on. And the only reason why they say it started in 2022 is because the people that I was having lunch with forgot the fact that the United States started the war in 2014 with the coup, and they set the stage for it going back, towards the end of World War II. So this war is I call this a civilizational war. We have the same situation in Palestine. There you had at the end of World War I, the Arab peoples wanted to have democracy. The British and the French told them they could have it if they cooperated against the Ottoman Empire. They lied. The British lied and split all these territories of the Ottoman Empire up into Syria and Lebanon, Palestine, and so on. And then, of course, to add insult to injury, serious insult to injury, the Balfour Declaration basically paved the way for the Zionists to come in, and these people from primarily Eastern Europe, and then they had, in order to create a state, they had to bring in people from other many Arab countries and other countries, and often they used intimidation tactics to get people to move there. So the whole point of the Israeli state has been to be essentially a colony in the middle of the Middle East. And as I think it was Caspar Weinberger, a former Secretary of Defense, said that Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier. So this is another aspect of this civilizational war of the West against the rest. And then, of course, you have the situation in Iran, where it's the same thing. They have to get control. They cannot bear to see a country be sovereign, especially when it has a lot of resources. So that is basically what's going on here. And it's not just those countries. As I mentioned, there's a number of other countries that are all in various stages of war. And it's all, very upsetting. And the question is, when is this war going to end? And what we see is that gradually, since World War II, the countries that were formerly colonized, namely China and India, the Southeast Asian countries, African countries, South American countries, the peoples of all those countries have been struggling to get free of this Western hegemony, this Western arbitrary rule. So, and now we have, Marco Rubio saying that he wants to reestablish colonialism. He's quite upfront about it. Well, thank you, Marco. We kind of thought that was what was going on, but thank you for making it so explicit. So this is what I call a civilizational war. It's not a war of Ukraine against Russia. It's not a war of Israel against Palestine. This is a much bigger. These are all theaters of a much bigger war of Western, quote unquote, civilization against the rest of the world. And it's not clear how this will all end up. BRICS, the BRICS organization, the BRICS countries hopefully will be able to insulate themselves from this kind of bullying that the United States and Europe, NATO have been conducting all these years. So, but that just remains to be seen. But the main point that I'm making here is that we shouldn't see these conflicts in isolation. We need to see them as part of a whole. And who is instrumental in causing these conflicts in the first place? It's often the CIA, which I mentioned was involved both in Ukraine and in Iran and in Iraq. And MI6, the British have been involved. They were involved in Iran, certainly. They're involved in Ukraine. So, in African states, the colonial powers have been involved in them for, at least a couple of centuries, causing the same kinds of problems. And it's telling that there are a fair number of Russians who oppose Russia's policies. They think that Russia is just another imperialist power. However, who are the African countries going to for help to get rid of the colonial powers? They're going to Russia and also to China. So that's, that is what it is. So I think I'll end it there. Again, if you want to support my channel, you can give it a like or a share or a comment, and you can, make a donation if you'd like. That would be very helpful. So thanks again for listening, and I will talk with you again soon.